Welcome. I'm so happy to see so many of you here today. My name is Anna Månsson and I work at the alumni office here at SSE, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event. First, I want to mention some practicalities. Due to the number of participants, we have muted you, but feel free to submit any questions you have in the chat. There will be time for a Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion. Also, we'll be recording the webinar, so it's available afterwards, and we will send you the link to it after this webinar. Now, let's proceed to the program. As you all know, the cultural and creative industries, especially the businesses that are heavily reliant on live or physical experiences, have been disrupted by the current COVID-19 crisis. However, this challenging time is also an opportunity for transformation, innovation, and learning. Tonight, we at SSE, in collaboration with the German SSE Alumni Hub, welcome you to a dynamic panel discussion that will reflect on both the ongoing impact and future solutions for the creative industry, as well as how cultural consumption, experience offerings, and participation patterns are changing during and after the pandemic. I would now like to introduce tonight's distinguished panel of speakers. Moderator, Erik Wikberg, Assistant Professor in War Studies at the Swedish Defense University and affiliated researcher at Stockholm School of Economics. Sofie Sagfossen, PhD in Consumer Psychology and Project Manager in Pedagogy and Digital Learning at Stockholm School of Economics. Cecilia Hillström, alum and owner and director of Cecilia Hillström Gallery here in Stockholm. And last but not least, Lukas Knoflach, alum and managing director at Sound Diplomacy's German office. And now, without further ado, I will now hand over the stage to you, Erik.
Thank you so much. I just saw that my connection broke for a minute there, so I hope that this will work. I'm very glad to be here. You can now see my presentation in full screen, right? So as already said, I'm now an assistant professor at the Swedish Defense University in War Studies, but my background is fully in the creative industries and more specifically about the art world and also the world of publishing and bookselling. And this webinar will focus on some of these creative industries. And I think that just as a short introduction, it's good to say something about what we mean by creative industries. Now, different people have conceptualized this sort of very hot industries and very popular tags of these industries. And my first point there, I'm just going to make three simple points. The first point is that we should forget about defining the creative industries. When I started out doing research on these things about 10 years ago, it was very popular to name industries to be within the creative industries, and it was sort of an outcome from different subsidizing and political initiatives that were targeting creative industries, but it was not really an analytical concept. And as you see these concepts in reality, you see that in sometimes when there are a lot of political initiatives targeting these industries, a lot of people say that they work in the creative industries and it becomes a buzzword. And then when these initiatives subdue, people don't really talk about the creative industries, or kulturella och kreativa näringar, as sometimes called in Sweden. And so I will go through a couple of ways to define, or not to define, but to conceptualize creative industries. But I think that the main point here is to understand that there isn't one definition of creative industries, and it's not really important from an analytical point of view. But one man that tried to conceptualize cultural industries, creative industries, is David Throsby. He's an economist from Harvard University, and he made this model of concentric views of creative industries. And this model, you can see it in different variations if you read more about David Throsby. His point is that there is a core where, for instance, artists, musicians, people that do what we sort of think of as traditional creative things. And then the cultural industries is a bit broader. So, for instance, there are activities that involve mass reproduction of expressive outputs. And then there are a lot of other people, say, for instance, sound technicians working with a concert. They are too included in the creative and cultural industries, but on an outer circle of this concentric model. And then lastly, you have the rest of the economy, which also benefit and exploit the expressive outputs generated by the creative industries. So this is a very common way to conceptualize what the creative industries are. Another way is to think of it as art worlds, different art worlds. And Arthur Danto was a professor in philosophy and also a very known art critic. And he published a paper in 1964 called The Art World, that is mostly known for. And he says that instead of focusing on what art is, he took the example of the Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes, you know, ready-mades, everyday objects that you put into an art space, and then said, this is art. And he was also very intrigued by Roy Lichtenstein, his sort of comic style pictures. If they are seen as really prestigious art in ambitious art papers, then what is art and what can it be? And instead of asking this question, what art is, he sort of turned it to be a question of who decides what art is. And he concludes that it's the art institutions, for instance, in the contemporary art world, it's the dominant players that really decide what art is. And that's also one way of looking at the creative industries, that you have different institutions within every field that determines what constitutes the field itself. And also another, maybe the most famous one, Pierre Bourdieu, had a conceptualization of cultural fields, fields of cultural production, where he says that there are cultural capital and economic capital that is sort of in a diametrically different and oppositional relation to each other. So, for instance, what you gain in the short run in economic terms, you lose in cultural capital. And this is something that a lot of post-Bourdieusian scholars have debated. And I think that there are lots of empirical examples where his model is not really typical to represent all of the art and all of the cultural production that there is, but he's still very influential in the field. And then you can also turn to philosophy. This is a book that actually came today that I and Isak Nilsson, the founding director of Art Initiative at Stockholm School of Economics, edited, focusing on object-oriented ontology and the philosophy of Graham Harman. It came today, and I haven't really seen the physical book yet, but here are two selfies from my colleagues, Isak and Pierre Guidemotou is a very important person at SSE working with the Art Initiative. He's the director, the current director. And this book, instead of focusing on the sociological relations in the art world, you sort of turn to the objects themselves. And second, there are great variations within certain industries. I've done research on the literary field, and you can see here that during the worst period of the Corona crisis, we saw that physical bookstores lost 35% of their sales, Whereas, for instance, online retailers had a really good year because people buy books online instead of in physical bookstores. So this is a point that is something that you should keep in mind, that it's really hard to talk about an industry on a whole, and it's often a lot of variations. And third, these industries are relatively dependent on the state, and there are a lot of relations with the state. So we won't discuss that very much today because it's, of course, very different in different states, but there is a political dimension to this that is also worth mentioning. So with that, I would like to conclude that we will focus today on 3 different industries: the art industry, the art world, musicians, and the experience industry. And so it will not be all of the creative industries, but these selected few. And with that, the speakers, the prominent speakers today have already been introduced, but once again, Cecilia Hillström, with a background in finance and banking, and who started her own gallery in 2012, and has been very involved in the SSE Art Initiative, initiating donations to the school. And also Sophie Sagfossen, who took her PhD in marketing at SSE, and from March 2021 will be an assistant professor in consumer psychology in Oslo. And lastly, Lucas Knuflach, who is also an SSE alumni and the managing director of Sound Diplomacy, Germany. So, who would like to take over? Do we start with Cecilia?
So I'm going to share my presentation. Right, so we're going to throw ourselves directly into the contemporary art world through the eyes of a gallerist, I guess. And the images in my presentations are all from gallery artists and from installation shots from the gallery, actually. Let's see. Let's see. Right. An art gallery is very much built up on live experience of art, and the galleries have taken a hard hit during the pandemic crisis. The role of the gallery could very much be compared to a publisher or an agent in the music industry. We're promoting an artist's career in a broad sense, but we're also providing traditional services like a space to exhibit and handling sales and everything like that. We're very much built on a live experience of an exhibition or a specific artwork. We're very much also oriented towards events, our big openings, talks, networking in the space. It's very much a hub for social interaction. So what about 2020 then? Well, that was of course a very difficult year for the galleries. Many international galleries remained closed for months. In Stockholm, we had some closures for a few weeks during the spring, and then some galleries opened up again or had by appointment arrangements. During the autumn, my sense is that most galleries remained open, but had to, of course, reorganize all types of events and openings to adhere to the restrictions. Art fairs are very important in our world. They were all cancelled, transferred to online or virtual viewing rooms with different kinds of hybrid arrangements between decentralized art fairs and combinations with online meetings. Many museums and art institutions closed, and maybe you all know that the big Giacometti exhibition only remained open for 3 weeks before Moderna Museet had to close down here in Stockholm, which is of course a big loss. And it's very unlikely that it will be able to open again. When it comes to the sales side, of course, we're very focused on actually selling contemporary art. And there's an important survey each year conducted by Art Basel in cooperation with UBS. UBS has been a long-term sponsor of this major art fair for many years. And in this survey, which focuses on the first half of 2020, we saw a drop in the sales of modern and contemporary art of roughly 36%. And at the same time, there was an increase in online sales from 10% the year before to approximately 37% in the spring. And I think that these numbers are fairly correct for the year as a whole. Of course, this had to do with the fact that in an international context, more than 90% of the galleries had to close their premises during the first 6 months. The participating galleries in this survey are about 800 galleries all over the world, basically. And many also considered this crisis to be much more serious than the latest financial crisis. And also, I think that in the beginning of the autumn, many galleries thought that 2021 would be even more challenging. Right now, I have a sense of a slow sort of pickup in terms of sales and our sort of operations as a whole. What about the way we sell art? Reaching out to existing clients, still the most important way of selling art. But we saw a shift when it came to art fairs. They dropped from a sort of a 3rd position in this list to a 6th position. And website sales and sales through social media, sending images became much more important, which is of course natural, as the art fairs didn't materialize in the way they usually do. So this is a very visible shift in the way we promote and sell art from the gallery's artists. This is also numbers from a survey which was conducted by Artsy, which is one of the leading online sales platforms for contemporary art. What about Sweden then? Well, during 2020, we saw quite a lot of crisis support directed towards the artists from the government side of the government. And we were trying to seek more specific support for the intermediaries, for the infrastructure in the business. Of course, we could take part in the sort of more general corporate relief packages like temporary layoffs. Some of us got rent reductions for the latter part of the spring 2020, but we were also very clear when we were trying to reach out to government officials about the fact that they need to support the whole infrastructure. And what we expect now for 2021 is an increase in public art acquisitions. In the latest government sort of budget for the culture sector, they allotted 2.5 million euros both to Moderna Museet and the Public Art Agency for acquisitions in contemporary art, and that's something all galleries are now eagerly expecting to see the result of this effort. So the conclusion would be that they're now supporting both sort of the supply side in continuous support to the artist, but also stimulating the demand. What about right now then? When in Sweden, it's almost a little bit like business as usual. Most galleries are actually open, which is in stark contrast to the museums. We obviously have limitations when it comes to the number of visitors. A side effect is that our private clients have more time to visit and spend time with us and discussing the art that we're showing. They're not traveling for business nor pleasure. And that's been an interesting sort of effect of actually people staying at home more often. We've seen an increase in online activities. We've been participating in decentralized art fair when we've had the exhibitions at the gallery, but there has been sort of separate arrangements when it comes to actually having online meetings with curators and international collectors. And there's definitely a focus towards a shift towards a domestic focus. Obviously, you can't travel, so you're trying to really dig where you're standing and see what's available in your home market. A few words about the short-term adaptations when it comes to this crisis. This is an image from the Armory Art Fair in New York, early March 2020, the last art fair that actually materialized before everything was shut down. And this is one of my artists exhibiting at this art fair, Katja Larsson. We definitely see an increase in the importance of commercial sales platforms online like Artsy. We've been improving the way that we do live broadcasting or record our talks and tours. the increase of online viewing rooms, even though our collectors claim to be super fed up with actually with viewing art like this, it's still something that we've seen being used very, very often. That all this implies an increase in online marketing costs, which have left some smaller businesses behind. It's quite costly. It's very expensive to record, film, photograph all the exhibitions and making them available online, which will be, in some cases, been problematic for smaller galleries. And as I mentioned before, there's definitely a focus on the local market versus the global art right now. But in the long run, everyone is now very much craving the real thing. This is an installation shot from a performance exhibition that we had at the gallery a couple of years ago with Christina Matouche, involving live performers, live visitors, of course. And I would say that in the long run, we will still see a very strong urge to actually experience exhibitions and art in a live context, even though there will be also other new elements that we need to use in order to make sure that we are sort of complementing the live art experience with the online arrangements. I do think that we will see further consolidation in the business. Smaller operations might be wiped out due to this crisis, when you had to sort of basically shut down your gallery for many months. There's a very uncertain future for the art fairs, I would say, a development that already started before the COVID crisis. Questions about sustainability, transporting art and people all over the world, traveling, would that really be the way of going forward? That's a big question mark. I hope to see more cooperation between galleries, bilateral arrangements, swapping exhibitions, and that's something that's also been seen during the COVID crisis so far. Continued sales online is still important, but there is a limit to how much and what type of art and for what amount you could actually sell art online, I would say. But there's definitely going to be more flexible purchasing behavior. But again, the craving for a live experience is now very, very, very clear in the art market.
Thank you, Cecilia. It's a really interesting presentation, and I have lots of questions, but I look at the time schedule. I think that we should move on to Lucas and then take all the questions together. So Lucas, are you ready?
Yes. I'm just gonna share my screen. And do you see the screen now?
We see it in full screen.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with all of you and give you some insights about our work and how the music ecosystem and the nighttime economy is impacted by COVID. Just to there we go. So just to tell you a bit about the work we do at Sound Diplomacy. I've been with the company for 5 years, and since last year I'm a managing director of the German office, which means I'm responsible for the German-speaking market and also our engagement on an EU level. And we work with cities and governments on music and nighttime economy policy. And to give you a bit of an idea, I wanted to show this infographic that explains some of the sector and some of the jobs that are impacted or that the music ecosystem impacts. So, when we have no artists or when artists aren't paid fairly, or when there is no live music, it doesn't just impact them, but it impacts the entire music ecosystem. And with that, it impacts hundreds of jobs that are connected, hundreds of types of jobs that are connected, but also the industries that use music, such as advertising, such as film. And so, in order to maximize the value of the music ecosystem from a policy perspective, as a city or as a region, you have to understand music as an infrastructure, similar to the way we understand water supply or waste disposal as an infrastructure. and with that create intentional and deliberate policies to understand its value, to know where it is, to know what it's made up of, and to understand the diversity of who is engaged with it. So when we work with governments, we help them to understand music as an infrastructure and also create intentional policies for that. I mean, we all know, before I start with the slide, so when I talk about music and nighttime economy, I think nighttime economy is also a term that has become more prevalent in the last years. And when I talk about it in terms of music, it relates to the cultural nighttime economy, which basically means, you know, the businesses that are open after, depending on what definition, after 6 p.m. or after 7 p.m. And which mostly is, you know, live music, clubs, nightlife, but also studios, also the transport, and stuff like that. So just yesterday, and I added this today, Ernst & Young released a new report that states that Europe's cultural and creative sector has been hit harder by the coronavirus crisis than every other industry except aviation. And that doesn't only include music, but all creative industries. And so when you look at music, the live music sector has been impacted the most. I mean, as most of you know, music venues were the last to close and are most likely the last to open, at least fully. And then connected to that, obviously the revenue streams of musicians and also songwriters were severely impacted because the live music revenue broke away. And in terms of the songwriters, also the revenue that is distributed by performing rights organizations. For example, when music is performed live, and also when, for example, music is played in retail, and retail was closed. A lot of the retail was or is closed at the moment, which impacts the revenue streams over, you know, like especially like in the year after. On the other hand, for example, the recorded music revenue grew by, depending on which territory you look at, by between 4 and 6% in the first half of 2020, which is mostly due to the streaming, which is not necessarily so much an effect of COVID, but also a trend that has been going on for the last couple of years. But overall, the music consumption has increased also last year. I want to go and explain some of the challenges that we're currently facing. I mean, as I just explained, you know, the subsectors are affected very differently, and it's important to understand that when looking at policies, when looking at relief, government relief programs. For example, certain sectors have a huge prevalence of freelancers and sole traders. For example, like the artists, the live music sector, but in some countries also the music education sector. And at least in our experience and from what we could see how governments were supporting, you know, during the crisis, I think these, especially freelancers and sole traders, it took some time for them to receive relief, and it was fairly bureaucratic, and it's still difficult. So a lot of people had to, you know, dig into their savings, which for a musician is quite problematic, because, you know, they might have saved up like touring from a year before and required it for like a certain period of time. And then there's the general challenge of the dependency on live music revenue. So only a small fraction of artists can actually live from their streaming royalties. And there was actually, I don't know if anybody followed that, but there was a parliamentary inquiry in the UK about exactly that. And it's a very interesting discussion because it impacts, there's so many revenue streams for artists, and it's so complicated and also dependent on, you know, the contract deal with your label, and not only, you know, the amount of money that, for example, Spotify pays out in royalties. So overall, I think looking at the sector, I think specifically artists, venues, and the support staff of the live music sector will actually require support after other elements of the economy have opened. And I think one thing I haven't mentioned from the slide is a general issue the cities were facing before the pandemic. And I think that's something that people have realized, that the pandemic has you know, these are not necessarily all new problems that we're suddenly facing, but the pandemic laid bare some of the underlying issues that the whole ecosystem was facing and just poured oil on it. And I think, I mean, also remembering my time in Stockholm, which is a fair amount of time ago, but, you know, I think when you look at clubs, for example, I think, you know, depending on the nighttime economy policy of a city, it may be friendly or unfriendly, but I think it's important to understand that, you know, clubs, venues, they're an important incubator for creatives and also for people that experience these things. And it's important to understand that this is an infrastructure that is required for this sector to exist. So I want to, in the next 2 slides, I want to look a bit into how a phasing out of this could look like and what the challenges are. So on one hand, there's the supply challenges. So we have venues that have been closed for months. As you saw in an earlier slide, a lot of venues have closed, and the closing rate is much higher than the years before. So you have venues on the supply side, you have venues, you have support staff, and you have artists. And it's important to understand that, you know, once a venue closes, it's much more difficult to open it up again. So the effects, I think we might feel in a couple of years when suddenly there's no space in certain cities for music venues or for studios or for galleries, for example, like because they have been displaced or run out of business. And from the economic side, the economic model will be challenged for a while, because at the moment we don't know, nobody's buying, I mean, concerts are being announced, but nobody's buying tickets, and ticket sales are incredibly important to be able to plan ahead. Most likely for the coming period, there's going to be much higher costs because of higher hygiene standards, bureaucratic tape, and also less revenue because of capacity restrictions. And on the artist side, I think international touring is only going to come back very slowly, and I don't think we'll see international touring this year, which on the other hand might also be an opportunity, you know, for local artists to, you know, to be appreciated more. And I think this is also something that we saw in March. On the demand side, I think there's the big challenge. There's the big challenge of, we don't know how the audience will actually, how the behavior has changed during the pandemic. So I'm just going to read this off. In August, Music Canada did a study, an audience study, where 55% of the audience said that they will at least wait 6 months or longer to attend a music festival after physical restrictions. And for large concert venues, it was 60%. And similar results were shown in a study by McKinsey, where they said that 2/3 of the audience said that they will only slowly go back to events, or will go back to events more rarely than, but also historically, and I think Sophie can probably say this better, I think self-assessments are not a good predictor for actual behavior in the long run. And I hope that this will actually pick up more quicker, but it's definite that the demand will be slower to pick up, and especially for, you know, venues and spaces that are dependent on tourism. So I'll move to the next slide.
Because we're a little behind the time schedule, so I think if you could wrap up sort of quickly, that would be
okay.
Great.
Then I'll because Sophie will talk about digital experiences, so I'm going to leave this out and just talk about, just go into the last slide. So I think what's the long-term game, and how can we create a more sustainable ecosystem? So I think both from an economic, social, and cultural perspective, music and culture will play a vital role in recovery. And together with, you know, a couple of cities and partners, we've created a recovery plan that includes music and outlines, you know, policies that place music and culture at the center of recovery. And since we're running out of time, I can share this with a link, and you can read up if you're interested. Yeah, thanks. If anybody wants to stay in touch, but I'll make space for Sophie.
Thank you so much, Lucas. And just let's continue with the Sophie, and then we'll have a continued discussion.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas, and thank you, everyone. I hope you're still awake. It's very late in the day and it's dark outside. So I choose to stand up and to get some more energy. And that brings me to where I'm coming from, which is psychology. So now we're going to take a look at the consumer perspective and how the subjects are thinking. So I'm probably going to share some light on the examples that Cecilia and Lucas mentioned from the real world, but I'm going to tackle these issues from a theoretical standpoint to understand why do we see these different consumer behaviors, basically. So why are humans acting the way we do? And my background is both in research, but also in practice. So I've co-founded 2 startups in the experience-related industries. I've also consulted in the sponsorship industry, both for sports and cultural creative industries. And my research is in embodied cognition, which is a fancy way of saying that our human bodies affects our way of thinking. So if you feel tired at the moment and feel that you have a hard time to concentrate, I suggest you get up and move, do some jumping jacks, or just stand up and take a couple of steps, and then you will feel more awake and you will learn more from this seminar. Okay, so what's the difference between live and a digital experience? Me and my colleague, Christopher Laurel, we wrote an article laying out 3 different scenarios from COVID, trying to understand what the differences are and what the future can look like. So first of all, we have this, to start with the basics, we have our 5 senses, and there are of course very important differences. So to put it short, I would say that a live experience is obviously very multisensory. You have the sounds, you have the visuals, you can have the haptics to touch things, you can taste things, smell things. There's also these interhuman things. You can feel like the energy in a crowd and so on in a live setting. In a digital setting, the focus is clearly on the audio and the visual components. You can see things and you can hear things. But apart from that, it's very hard to transfer these other senses digitally. It can be done to some extent, but I'll leave it to that. The other really important downstream effect of going digital as opposed to live is the social connection. And I think we've all experienced this, considering now that we're sitting on Zoom and staring into a screen. Maybe this is like for hours every day. And this is a problem for our human brains and our perception. So we cannot really communicate in a perfect way this way compared to live, because we have these mirror neurons in our brain that help us communicate between each other. So what they do is basically that we mimic the person we see and we feel what they feel in a sense. So that's how we understand each other on a neurological level. And that's harder to pick up on screen because it's lower resolution and we can't see each other properly, basically. The other thing is the small asynchronicity, which also makes it really tiring for the human brain to hang around. So even if we have a good connection, it's still not the same synchronicity as talking to someone in a live setting. And you probably feel this way, like anecdotally, like just looking at yourself and how you like to hang out with people you like. So the effect is that we feel less social relatedness, which is a basic human psychological need, and it's impaired for many reasons, but in part due to our mirror neurons and the synchronicity issues with online. Then we have this concept of authenticity, and it's a very like holistic concept, like what's authentic. I mean, that's a subjective thing, but experiences that are very heavy immersion experience, when you're immersed in a physical setting, like for instance, like Cecilia mentioned her, like obvious an art gallery or performance art would be even like, to me, would be even more immersive. Or a great concert where in a crowd, you're just surrounded by all this sensory input. So those experiences feel very authentic to people compared to some live settings. Of course, there are exceptions. I mean, to mention one is esport. I mean, that's a setting where the whole sport is created digital. So to the players of esport, that is a heavy immersion experience for them, and it's created for being that way from the start. So the atmosphere is really a holistic thing. It's to be a part of something bigger than yourself. So that's what people mention when they talk about extraordinary experiences that give meaning to their life, basically. And then you have this basic psychological thing, like we have emotional contagion. So what other people feel is actually contagious. So when people are smiling, we smile back. If people are anxious, we get anxious, and so on. So if you're in a really excited crowd, then you can feel this excitement yourself, which can be both nice and not nice sometimes. So obviously, social distancing leads to a smaller possibility to connect with a community, and less possibility to create identity for people and feel that connection. And that could be in all these sectors, art, music, and so on. So on a more market level, the differences are also that to have something digital implies lower value sometimes, not always, because digital content is seen as having very low or zero marginal costs. What do I mean by that? I mean that it doesn't cost more to play a song 1 million times than it costs it to record it once. But after that, it doesn't cost more to play it more times in a digital world. In the old world, you had to print CDs or whatever and distribute them. So obviously, there were more marginal costs involved. And also, the history of the internet is that content has this legacy, and there's this expectation that content online should be free. We've gotten used to that. It has low value, low cost, and there is generally a low willingness to pay for a digital product compared to a physical product. Not always, I'm just saying generally. Take, for instance, a webinar as compared to a seminar. How can you say that a webinar is exclusive and online? How do you get that exclusivity feeling? It's very hard. You can, of course, say that it's exclusive, but does it feel exclusive? I mean, it's hard to create that compared to a physical setting where you can be in a really fancy venue and you can have a limited amount of people who can be admitted and so on. So that can be tricky. And then, as I said, we have these learned habits that content online should be free or very low cost. And to blame is, of course, I mean, to some extent, the business models of freemium and also the advertising financed media models that has contributed to these habits. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that's how I see it. If anyone is working, at a big media company, so I'm not blaming you. I'm just presenting it. So I see 3 scenarios for the future. Me and Christopher talked about this. So one scenario is this. This is the matrix. This is the hyper-digital scenario. In this scenario, we predict that experiences will remain digital and they will only be developed for a digital format. And some experiences are, in fact, superior in that format, and there's no need to do it live anymore. And I would predict that it's mostly the ones that have an emphasis on the audio and visual components, which means that restaurants, for instance, they will not go digital for obvious reasons. And an example here that many have pointed to, which was kind of a really nice story, was the performer Travis Scott. I don't know if you heard about it. He was an artist who transformed a concert and made it entirely digital. And I think he had close 27 million visitors in this game in Fortnite. So he was doing a concert fully in the game and had gamers from all over the world joining the concert and being participants. So this was very different from a normal concert, and it was probably richer in some dimensions. But again, it was made for a certain crowd, and this would not. And he is also like a big player, so it was probably a massive cost to set this up, but it was quite successful in that sense. They gained a lot of attention and many visitors. So then we have the opposite. We have the closer to what Cecilia and Lucas were talking about, the more live experiences. And here we call it the nostalgic scenario, where we predict that values which doesn't transfer easily to the digital format, for the reasons I mentioned in the beginning, they will go back to being live. And I think in some cases they will even be more valued because now we know what we're missing, right? So one example that I just came across was that Roskilde Festival, which I used to visit many times as when I was younger. They had to cancel in 2020, obviously, but it turned out most of their guests would not want a refund. They wanted to keep their tickets. So it ended up that they sold out next year's festival in record time. So more than 1 year ahead, they were already sold out for next year. So clearly people still crave experiences, connecting to what Lucas said, but it's still open, like how fast are we going to go back, and are all people going to go back? We don't know. I think restaurants business will also inevitably go back to a nostalgic live scenario. And I think in general, experiences which has a high social value and this immersion capacity, they will still be a strong option moving on. And then, of course, we can think of this as a hybrid. So we will have formats coexisting. Some offerings will be offered both live and digitally in a hybrid format. So the upside of the hybrid and digital is, of course, that you can reach more people at a lower cost, maybe attract other customers which normally wouldn't have made it there. So that could be a good thing. And of course, the drawback is that the competition online is fierce, basically, because if you're offering something online, you have to, in effect, you have to compete with everything that is on the internet. Everything. That is what you're competing against for attention, effectively. So I think some share of business meetings, business travel, parts of education and medicine is an example where some of it will remain digital even after post-COVID for the reason I mentioned. So do I have 1 more minute, Eric?
Actually, we have to go on. We are 10 minutes behind, but it's
okay.
But let's do it very quickly.
Yeah, so my last point is just that from a market perspective, there is this tension, right, between the blockbusters, the products that make a lot of money, and the really long tail. And you can think of this in terms of like, I guess, small artists or even small galleries, or connecting to Lucas' industry, smaller venues or smaller artists. And what we see over time is that, quite contrary to what researchers suggested like a decade ago with online, they suggested that the long tail would be like a success story, but we can actually see that it's getting longer with smaller and smaller actors, but they're also getting less and less revenue, which makes it harder for them to thrive. And during COVID, the long tail has really been challenged in many ways, and I think we have to consider what long-term effects that has, because the blockbusters don't come up out of nothing. They often come from the long tail. So downstream, I think that would be a problem. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions from the audience and also questions that we had beforehand. So I can just ask you to give brief questions. There's a lot of information here to digest in these 3 great presentations, but one thing I think you had in common, you, Cecilia, talked about the infrastructure of the art world, and you, Lucas, talk about the ecosystem. What do you think is the most important now to support and preserve and protect the ecosystem or infrastructure of the experience industry, the music industry, and the art world?
If I can go first, I would say that what I also stressed in my presentation is that one has to see the whole system. Sometimes we tend to forget the role of the intermediaries, the galleries, the art dealers. Of course, I'm seeing this from my position as a commercial player in this field, but the commercial side of the art world is very important, both for providing a venue for emerging artists. If we can't show the young ones, they will never get museum exhibitions, etc. So one has to sort of recognize the whole system, where I believe that we, even though we're small players to some extent, have a very crucial role in providing a place to actually show the young artists. And that therefore I welcome this initiative, that there are actually some more the acquisition budgets have been increased. We'll see how that works out during the year.
I think in the music industry, I think from a venue perspective and from the the people that are connected to the venues, which is everything from booking agents to promoters to artists to technicians, I think that's just, in the short term, it's really just survival mode and making sure that they don't have to shut down because there's just no revenue at all, at least during lockdown. And then in the medium term, I think it's just being able to provide I think it's an assistance in make it work economically, so they can start events again. Because I also think, and that's what I meant, I also think from a social perspective, I think, or from a societal perspective, just being able to go to events again when it's possible, I think is going to be a huge relief from a social perspective. Just being able to see people again, being able to experience live music again, is going to be a huge process of healing for everybody. And so I think I'm pretty sure that most governments have understood this.
One thing that I thought was really interesting with your presentation, Sophie, is how we go through multi-sensory experiences to, of course, digitally, it's not that multi-sensory. Do you think that this experience has changed somehow during the crisis, that we're more attuned to doing events online? Have we changed the perception of the digital somehow?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think yes, in short. I think we have gotten used to technology, but we have also all, I think, experienced this technological stress of how you have to make a lot of things work, and it's stressful when technology is not working properly, and it also impairs the quality. So I think, yeah, we've all been forced to learn a lot, and we're learning, like, for what situations is it helpful to be digital, and I think we also learned what we value to do live.
Yes.
I can tie into that a little bit. I think, when you look at, I thought it was very interesting, to get the research perspective, because it resonates a lot with I think what I see. And I mean, to me, the hybrid model, I think that's, at least for now, seems very likely. And I think we can already see that shift. And when it comes to innovation in the live sector, I think it's happening fairly slowly, maybe also because it's not the most innovative sector in a lot of ways. But but it is happening. And I think we're going to see a lot of stuff coming this year and the next year because of that. And you already saw, I think that's something I didn't get to in my slide. You already saw that there are some signs, like, you know, Live Nation just 2 weeks ago bought like a big ticketed streaming platform, so they can complement their live experiences and, you know, show their concerts all around the world. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and also, you know, events experimenting with blockchain technology and kind of drop token systems and stuff like that. I think it's going to be interesting the next year.
There are a lot of questions from the audience, too many to really bring up in this short time. But one common thread in a lot of questions is that, what do you think about these changes? What changes are here to stay, and to what extent will we go back to normal after the pandemic?
Yes, if I could go again, I would say that I feel pretty familiar in this hybrid sort of scenario that Sophie spoke about, that we will definitely be very happy to have being able to meet up with a lot of people live at the gallery, but we will also be able to use other tools that we haven't really been using in the past. And I think that the combination of being able to spread the word about the artists and the exhibitions through different kinds of online recordings or live talks will definitely be something that the art world has long been pretty slow in adapting, and that we will really have to, you know, be much better prepared for in the future. So that, I think, will be definitely a development that will stay with us.
I think that one interesting aspect that I reflect upon during your presentation is that you're talking about the primary market for contemporary art galleries. But then if you look at auction houses, they have actually done a lot of online auctions for many years. Why do you think that there is such a difference? In what way is
in many ways, I mean, the gallery business is quite conservative, quite traditional, but it also has to do with the fact that we do provide a space for this very immersive experience, and that we promote the artists through actually doing and curating exhibitions together with the artists. And I believe that that's our main sort of selling point. That's what we can provide, and I believe that that's something that we're a bit hesitant in providing too much information online, sending too many images, because then we don't get people to come to the galleries and the exhibitions. So I think that's we're very much into the live experience business, I would say, and that's what differs us from the marketplace, which is an auction house, very much more focused on selling objects, but we're actually promoting art in a broader sense, I would say, even though we're definitely into sales as well.
Yeah, makes total sense. Sophie?
Can I answer really short? Okay, so if I put it really blunt, so the boring stuff will have to move digitally, but the fun stuff in our lives, it's going to be live also, for sure. Imagine like banking, going to the doctor, business meetings. Shall I go on? What would you prefer? Like, we can see they're going to go more digital, whereas the more hedonic experiences, it's going to be live elements in those, for sure.
It sounds good to me.
And we only have 1 minute left before I will hand over to Anna again. But I did get one question from the audience, and that's, please, it's rather an imperative. Please suggest 3 positive outcomes that we can bring with us and work towards after this session. You have one positive outcome of the pandemic that you would like to
one.
Yes.
Okay, I can start. If it's one, I think, and I do think that has changed, I think from a society perspective, a reevaluation of the appreciation of art and music and culture. And that just started from, you know, I think it started with the pandemic, and I think it's gonna, and maybe it's too naive, but I hope that it's gonna stay, and people are gonna reevaluate their relationship to local art, local music, and also just culture in general?
I believe that from my perspective, it has created a lot of stronger relationships with our visitors at the gallery, but also a stronger relationship between colleagues. And I think that we will be more eager to work together in the future than we've been in the past.
I think the fact that it forced consumers to change their habits and learn new things and question their lifestyles in some areas, that is a hard thing to do. That's what marketers are trying to do, but this was like on a massive scale.
Interesting. Thank you so much for your presentations, and I'll give you an applaud like this if you see my Zoom window, and hand over the word to Anna.
Yeah, I also want to thank all of you for such an interesting discussion and for sharing this with us. And I hope everyone else enjoyed this as much as I did. And speaking of, we would very much appreciate it if everyone who joined us tonight can please fill out the very brief survey, the evaluation survey that we will send out after this webinar, together with a link to our upcoming webinar taking place on February 11th, called The Future of Travel and Urban Mobility. That's held in conjunction with the UK Friends of SSE, where Andreas Schörling, Managing Director at Flixbus in the UK, moderates a discussion with Henrik Kjellberg, CEO of Aways, and Fredrik Hjelm, founder of Voi, on the evolution of the travel and urban transportation industry. So like I said, this event takes place on February 11th, and a link will be included together with the evaluation survey that we will send out shortly. Also, a recording of this webinar will be available shortly. So thank you all and have a lovely evening. Bye.
Thank you.